Every single day, you reach into your pocket, pull out a small glass rectangle, and conduct the most intimate details of your life. You send a highly personal text message. You argue with your partner, or you transfer thousands of dollars between bank accounts. You do all of this with an absolute, unshakable belief that you are operating in a secure, profoundly private space. But what if I told you that the very concept of communication privacy is actually a radical, highly recent invention? The unsettling truth is that for most of the 20th century, right up until the 1970s, millions of American families absolutely did not have a private phone line. There were no passwords. There was no end-to-end encryption. Whenever you made a phone call, whether you were whispering sweet nothings to a lover, arguing over gambling debts, or trying to close a sensitive business deal, the neighbor living 3 houses down could simply lift their receiver, hold their breath, and listen to every single word you said. There was an entire era where privacy simply did not exist. Your ability to call an ambulance depended entirely on the goodwill of a gossiping neighbor. So, how did millions of people survive in a system where every whisper was a public broadcast? And what was the breaking point that forced America to change forever? To truly comprehend the sheer logistical madness of the party line system, we have to rewind the clock and look at what the telephone was originally meant to be. When Alexander Graham Bell secured the patent for the telephone back in 1876, it was absolutely not envisioned as a mass-market consumer good. In its infancy, the telephone was strictly a point-to-point technology, requiring massive, heavy wooden box phones mounted to the wall. There were no automated switchboards that could instantly route your voice across the country. If you were a wealthy steel magnate in Pittsburgh or a Wall Street banker in New York in the 1880s, and you wanted to be able to call your downtown office from your uptown mansion, you had to literally pay a company to string a dedicated physical copper wire all the way from your parlor desk directly to your office. It was a private, closed loop. It was ridiculously expensive. In the 1890s, leasing a single telephone line could cost upwards of $150 a year, which roughly translates to thousands of dollars in today's money. It was highly cumbersome and entirely reserved for the ultra-rich major corporations and government offices. For the average American family, having a telephone in the house was as absurd as having a private telegraph operator sitting in the living room. But as the 20th century dawned, the ambition of the telecommunications industry began to shift. Enter Theodore Vail, the mastermind architect of the AT&T and Bell system empire. In 1907, Vail took control of AT&T and established a sweeping, almost utopian vision for the company. He coined the famous motto, "One policy, one system, universal service." Vail didn't just want the telephone to be a luxury toy for the urban elite. He wanted to connect every single American household, from the bustling avenues of Chicago to the most isolated, dusty farmhouses in the rural Midwest. He recognized that the true power of a communication network scales exponentially with the number of people plugged into it. There was just one massive, undeniable problem staring Vail and his engineers in the face. The United States is geographically enormous. The sheer math of universal service simply did not work out. Telephones required heavy, insulated copper wire. They required thousands of miles of thick wooden utility poles, massive amounts of physical labor, and complex central switching stations staffed by hundreds of human operators. If the Bell system were to string a dedicated individual copper wire from a central exchange out to every single isolated farmhouse in Nebraska, or to every single home in the rapidly expanding streetcar suburbs of Massachusetts, the company would go bankrupt instantly. The infrastructure cost of providing a private line to every citizen was a financial impossibility. And this is where it gets interesting. The phone company engineers had to figure out an infrastructure hack. Instead of running 10 separate expensive lines down a long, winding rural road to serve 10 different houses, they asked a very simple question. Why not just run one heavy-duty copper wire and branch it off into all 10 homes? Welcome to the birth of the party line. It was an engineering compromise that fundamentally altered the social fabric of the country. It worked exactly like it sounds. You, and anywhere from 2 to 20 other families in your immediate geographic vicinity, were physically wired onto the exact same electrical circuit. Your telephone was not uniquely yours. It was merely a node on a communal network. But this raised an immediate glaring issue. If 10 houses are sharing one wire, how do you know when a call is actually for you? The telecommunications companies couldn't route the electrical ring to just one specific phone on a shared circuit, so they invented a maddening, complex system of ring codes. Every single household on a party line was assigned a distinct rhythmic pattern. Your house might be assigned 2 long rings and 1 short ring. The family across the street was 1 short ring and 2 long rings. The widow at the end of the block might just be 3 short rings. Every single time a call came down that wire, the bells would ring loudly in every single house simultaneously. Imagine the psychological toll of this daily reality. You are sitting at the dinner table, and the phone rings. You don't just pick it up. Everyone in the house has to stop talking, freeze in place, and listen closely to count the cadence of the metallic bells. Long, long, short. If it wasn't your code, you were supposed to ignore it and let it ring. It created a bizarre social dynamic where the entire neighborhood was instantly alerted the moment anyone received a phone call. You always knew when your neighbors were getting a call, at what time of day, and how often. The private act of communication was suddenly announced with a literal ringing bell in everyone's living room. It was an imperfect, heavily compromised system, but for a few decades, it seemed like a reasonable sacrifice to bring rural America into the modern age. The party line was supposed to be a temporary stepping stone, a cheap rural alternative until the technology caught up and everyone could afford a private line. But things were about to take a dramatic turn. This quirky, rural compromise might have quietly faded away as AT&T laid more cables across the nation, if it weren't for a massive global disruption that was about to flip the American economy completely upside down. That massive disruption, of course, was the Second World War. When the Japanese military struck Pearl Harbor in December 1941, the United States was violently thrust into a global conflict that demanded an immediate, total transformation of the American economy. Virtually overnight, civilian manufacturing was halted. The federal government established the War Production Board to seize absolute control over the nation's raw materials, directing everything toward the war effort. And there was one material the military needed more than almost anything else to keep its forces communicating, moving, and firing: copper. The very same heavy, insulated copper wire that AT&T was slowly rolling out to American neighborhoods was suddenly reclassified as a highly restricted, strategic military asset. To give you an idea of the scale, a single P-47 Thunderbolt fighter plane required roughly 300 pounds of copper. A single naval battleship required over 1 million feet of copper wiring just to function. The military's appetite for the metal was insatiable, which meant the domestic telephone industry hit a sudden, devastating brick wall. In April 1942, the federal government took a drastic step. The War Production Board issued General Conservation Order L-50. This sweeping federal mandate effectively banned the installation of any new private residential telephone lines across the entire country. The government decreed that telecommunications companies had to strictly conserve their existing copper networks. Unless you were a doctor, a public official, or working directly in a defense plant, you were legally barred from getting a private line. It did not matter if you were a millionaire factory owner or a prominent local politician. You could not simply buy your way into communication privacy. The copper belonged to the troops. Because of this order, the party line underwent a radical geographic shift. Originally designed as an infrastructure hack to connect dusty rural farmhouses, the shared line suddenly invaded the bustling, densely populated urban centers of America. Apartment buildings in New York City, tightly packed row houses in Chicago, and the sprawling new streetcar developments of Los Angeles were entirely stripped of private communication. If you moved into a new apartment in 1943 and wanted a telephone, you were forced onto a party line with the strangers living above, below, and next door to you. How do you convince a fiercely independent nation to willingly surrender their privacy and share a single electrical wire with their noisy neighbors? You wrap it in the American flag. The Bell Telephone Company, working closely with the government, launched a massive, relentless propaganda campaign to rebrand the party line not as a frustrating downgrade, but as a noble, patriotic duty. Glossy posters were plastered in post offices and train stations across the country. They featured grim illustrations of soldiers huddled in muddy trenches, clutching field radios, accompanied by heavy, guilt-inducing slogans like, "Are you holding up his call?" or "Be brief, someone needs the line." The psychological pressure was immense. How could you possibly complain to the local phone operator about your neighbor listening in on your grocery list when American boys were fighting and dying in the European theater? You simply couldn't. Demanding a private phone line was viewed as selfish, bordering on un-American. This aggressive wartime conditioning was incredibly effective. By the time the war finally came to a close in the late summer of 1945, the statistics were completely staggering. It is estimated that roughly 75% of all residential telephone subscribers in the United States were sharing a party line. 3 out of every 4 connected homes in the country had absolutely no privacy. But here is a fascinating twist of history. You might assume that once the Axis powers surrendered, the troops came home and the military stopped hoarding copper. The era of the shared line would quickly come to an end. The restrictions were lifted, so everyone could finally go back to having their own private conversations, right? Wrong. The situation actually grew substantially worse. The late 1940s and early 1950s ushered in the greatest demographic and economic explosion in American history, the baby boom, and the rapid rise of the modern suburb. Millions of returning GIs got married, utilized their GI Bill benefits, and rushed to buy newly built cookie-cutter homes in massive planned communities like Levittown, Pennsylvania. This created an absolute nightmare for the telecommunications industry. Every single one of these new suburban households demanded a telephone, and they wanted it immediately. In 1946, AT&T reported a backlog of over 2 million people sitting on waiting lists just to get a physical phone installed in their house, let alone a private line. The demand didn't just grow, it violently exploded. The telephone companies were completely caught off guard. They physically could not manufacture the heavy lead-sheathed cables, build the complex mechanical stepping switches, or hire enough human operators fast enough to keep up with the suburban sprawl. To connect this tidal wave of new suburbanites and clear the millions of backlogged orders, the phone companies had only one option. They doubled down on the party line system. They aggressively crammed 4, 8, and sometimes up to 10 families onto single circuits. The great irony of the 1950s American dream was that while you finally had your own private driveway, your own private lawn, and your own private television set, your voice was still chained to the community. What began as a rural necessity in the 1910s and morphed into a patriotic wartime sacrifice in the 1940s, was now permanently cemented as the inescapable, everyday reality for the American middle class. Millions of people found themselves living in dense, tightly packed neighborhoods, completely electronically tethered together. And that forced proximity was about to create a highly invasive, often infuriating new social culture that nobody was prepared for. Living on a party line was not just a minor technical inconvenience. It was a bizarre psychological experiment forced upon the American public. Because millions of people were suddenly tethered to the same electrical circuits as their neighbors, an entirely new set of unwritten social survival skills had to be developed overnight. Here is the reality of that shared infrastructure. Because absolutely anyone on your circuit could just pick up their phone and drop right into the middle of your conversation, a massive, quiet culture of eavesdropping exploded across the country. The people who habitually listened in were locally known as rubbernecks, or line snoops. But eavesdropping on a mid-century party line was actually an intricate art form. It wasn't as simple as just grabbing the phone off the wall. If you picked up the handset too quickly, the mechanical switch inside the phone would produce a loud, sharp click, instantly alerting everyone on the line that a spy had just entered the chat. To do it successfully, you had to learn how to lift the heavy bakelite receiver with the slow, agonizing precision of a bomb disposal expert. Once the phone was off the hook, the danger wasn't over. You had to physically clamp your hand firmly over the mouthpiece. The carbon microphones used in those iconic Western Electric rotary phones were incredibly sensitive. If you breathed a little too heavily, if you cleared your throat, or if a dog barked in your backyard, you were instantly caught. For countless housewives, retirees, and bored locals in the 1950s, this wasn't just occasional snooping. It was the primary form of daily entertainment. Long before the invention of reality television or the endless scrolling of social media, the party line was the neighborhood's live, unedited soap opera. You knew exactly who was struggling to pay their mortgage this month. You knew which husband was consistently coming home late from work. You knew the intimate details of what the doctor told the woman 3 houses down. It was an involuntary, daily stripping of all domestic secrets. Some clever individuals even began using the party line for primitive psychological warfare, deliberately loudly discussing fake plans or false rumors near the phone, knowing full well that a specific nosy neighbor was silently listening in on the other end. But this complete lack of privacy wasn't just a quirky neighborhood joke. It created intense, bubbling resentment and very real-world friction. Imagine you are trying to negotiate a sensitive business contract or secure a bank loan from your home office. You have to conduct that entire conversation knowing your fiercest local competitor, or the town gossip, might be silently taking notes on the same copper wire. Or think about the pure agony of trying to maintain a romantic relationship. You are whispering to your partner, trying to have a genuinely intimate moment, and suddenly you hear the faint, rhythmic clicking of Mrs. Higgins knitting in her rocking chair right there on the line with you. The romance is instantly dead. The absolute worst offenders, however, weren't the gossipy neighbors. It was the teenagers. As the massive baby boomer generation reached adolescence in the late 1950s and 1960s, they discovered the telephone as a tool for endless, unchaperoned social connection. Millions of teenagers in the new suburbs would come home from high school, sprawl out on the living room rug, and tie up the party line for 2, 3, sometimes 4 hours at a time, exhaustively dissecting who danced with whom at the local prom. The phone companies were so desperate to stop this that they actually printed etiquette pamphlets begging customers to limit their calls to 5 minutes. Nobody listened. This created a maddening power dynamic. If you were an adult who actually needed to use the utility you paid for every month, you were entirely at the mercy of a 14-year-old. You couldn't just dial out. You had to pick up the receiver, intentionally interrupt their conversation, and engage in a delicate social negotiation. You would have to clear your throat and formally ask, "Excuse me, Billy, but I really need to call the hardware store. Could you please yield the line?" And this is where the system truly broke down. If Billy was feeling rebellious, or if your neighbor simply didn't like you, they could just say no. They could refuse to hang up. And if they refused, you were completely, technologically powerless. There was no alternate route. There was no cellular backup in your pocket. You just had to place the receiver back in its cradle, sit in your kitchen, and boil with rage while you waited for permission to use your own phone. It was an infrastructure built entirely on the fragile honor system of human politeness. And as we all know, human politeness has a breaking point. What happens when the stakes are infinitely higher than a frustrated call to the hardware store? What happens when you don't just want the line, but you desperately need it to survive? But this entire social contract, this delicate dance of manners and unwritten rules, rested on a terrifyingly fragile foundation. It assumed that people, when pushed, would ultimately do the right thing. It assumed that a community sharing a copper wire actually cared about one another. But human nature is complex, and unfortunately, it can also be astonishingly selfish. When the stakes escalated from a frustrated father trying to call the hardware store to a genuine pulse-pounding emergency, the dark flaw of the party line system was violently exposed. What happens when you are entirely dependent on the empathy of a stranger, and that stranger simply refuses to care? The breaking point, the exact moment that permanently shattered the romanticized illusion of the friendly neighborhood telephone network, arrived with a heartbreaking tragedy in the state of New York in 1954. It was a normal afternoon. A mother, a woman named Lucille, was at home tending to her infant child. Without warning, the baby went into severe medical distress. The infant began turning blue, struggling violently to draw in a breath. In a state of absolute, blinding panic, Lucille rushed to the heavy rotary phone on the wall. Every second was the difference between life and death. She snatched the receiver off the cradle, ready to dial the operator to summon a doctor and an ambulance. But the moment she lifted the handset, she didn't hear the reassuring hum of a dial tone. She heard voices. Two women in her neighborhood were already on the line, casually chatting about mundane daily gossip. Lucille did not have time for the polite etiquette the phone company pamphlets recommended. She didn't gently clear her throat. She screamed into the carbon mouthpiece. She begged the two women to hang up immediately. She explained that her baby was dying, that she needed the line to call for emergency medical help, and she pleaded with them to break the connection so she could reach the operator. In a functioning, empathetic society, those two receivers would have been slammed down in a fraction of a second. But that is not what happened. One of the women on the line, deeply annoyed that her private conversation was being so rudely interrupted by this hysterical mother, flatly refused. She scolded Lucille. She coldly told the terrified mother, "Don't bother us. Wait your turn," and then deliberately kept the connection open. Even as Lucille continued to beg, the women held the line hostage. Because of the mechanical reality of how these shared circuits worked, Lucille was entirely trapped. She couldn't switch to another line. She couldn't bypass them. She was physically locked out of the communication grid by a neighbor who prioritized neighborhood gossip over a dying child. That fatal delay, that sheer, stubborn refusal to click the receiver down, cost the infant its best, and perhaps only, chance at survival. The ambulance was delayed, and the baby tragically died. When the details of Lucille's story broke, It sent absolute shockwaves across the entire United States. It wasn't just a local tragedy. It struck a deep, terrifying nerve in the American psyche. Every single person living on a party line suddenly looked at the telephone on their wall and realized they were trapped in the exact same vulnerable position. The newspapers ran with it, and the resulting investigative journalism began uncovering a terrifying, hidden pattern of similar incidents across the country. This was not an isolated event. Reporters found families who had stood helplessly in their front yards, watching their homes burn to the ground because a stubborn neighbor refused to yield the party line to call the fire department. They documented cases of people suffering massive heart attacks and victims of violent home invasions who were completely unable to summon the police simply because someone down the street was idly chatting about a recipe and fiercely guarding their phone time. The honor system was literally getting people killed. The public outrage was deafening, and it forced a massive institutional reckoning. State legislatures, which had previously allowed the telecommunications monopolies to run these shared networks however they saw fit, were suddenly backed into a corner. They had to step in. One by one, state governments across the country began drafting and passing strict emergency line yield laws. The legal landscape of American communication shifted overnight. Suddenly, if you were on a party line and someone broke into the conversation to declare a medical, fire, or police emergency, you were legally obligated to hang up your phone immediately. If you refused, you weren't just being a rude neighbor anymore. You were committing a serious crime. The penalties were deliberately harsh to shock the public into compliance. In many jurisdictions, refusing to yield an emergency line was punishable by a massive fine of up to $1,000, a devastating amount of money in the 1950s, and could even land you in a county jail for up to a year. Furthermore, anyone caught faking an emergency just to get the line for a normal call faced the exact same severe penalties. Phone companies were legally mandated to print these new criminal warnings in the boldest print possible right in the front pages of every single telephone directory distributed in the country. Before you even looked up a number, you were reminded that the infrastructure in your home was inherently dangerous. It was a massive, public admission of failure. This legal shift struck a fatal blow to the entire concept of the party line. It was the moment society collectively realized that the telephone was no longer a luxury novelty or a communal toy. It was critical, life-saving infrastructure. It proved, undeniably, that a communications network based on forced communal sharing and the honor system was fundamentally incompatible with the realities of a modern, fast-paced society. The realization had set in. Information needed to flow securely, instantly, and without the interference of human selfishness. The countdown to the death of the party line had officially begun. The emergency laws of the 1950s proved that the honor system was fundamentally broken. The law now dictated that the party line was a dangerous liability, but the telecommunications monopolies couldn't just snap their fingers and give everyone a private wire overnight. They still had a massive physical infrastructure problem. The mechanical switching systems that routed calls across the country were incredibly clunky and physically maxed out. To give millions of expanding suburban households their own dedicated line, the phone companies needed a technological miracle. And in the 1960s and 70s, they finally got one. It was called the Electronic Switching System, or ESS. Before this invention, connecting a phone call required massive, warehouse-sized rooms filled with loud, moving mechanical parts. Metal switches violently clacked together to physically bridge a copper circuit. It took up an enormous amount of real estate and required constant human maintenance. But the ESS computerized the entire process. It replaced those heavy mechanical relays with solid-state electronics and early computer programming. Suddenly, routing millions of individual private phone calls became exponentially cheaper, incredibly fast, and required a fraction of the physical space. ESS was the silent, computerized assassin of the party line. Armed with this new technology, AT&T and the regional phone companies began a massive, multi-billion-dollar campaign to rip out the old infrastructure. The extermination of the party line did not happen all at once. It was a slow, methodical retreat. Throughout the 1970s, as computerized switching rolled into the suburbs, families eagerly paid the extra installation fees to finally upgrade to a private connection. They were desperately buying their way out of the neighborhood surveillance network. As the heavy mechanical rotary dials gave way to sleek, modern touch-tone phones, the social fabric of the American neighborhood quietly fractured. There was actually a strange, unexpected melancholy for some older generations when their shared lines were finally severed. Suddenly, the house was incredibly quiet. You no longer knew when the widow down the street was getting a call from her son in the military. You no longer heard the muffled, dramatic arguments about the local grocer's debts. A very specific, hyper-local form of community intimacy, as invasive and infuriating as it often was, completely evaporated. The neighborhood soap opera was canceled forever. By the year 1980, the transformation was nearly absolute. The number of active party lines plummeted to under 5% nationwide. By the dawn of the 21st century, they were practically extinct, lingering only as a bizarre historical artifact in the most rugged, isolated mountainous terrains of the country, where laying new cable was still deemed too expensive. The average American had finally achieved the ultimate middle-class dream. They had purchased their absolute privacy. You could walk into your home, lock the deadbolt, pull the curtains, pick up the receiver, and say whatever you wanted. You could scream, cry, or negotiate $1 million contract, completely secure in the knowledge that your voice was traveling through a closed, impenetrable loop. This technological shift entirely rewired the psychological baseline of the American public. Think about how you view communication today. If you were born after the 1970s, you grew up with a deeply ingrained assumption that when you communicate, nobody else is listening. We treat communication privacy as a fundamental, almost constitutional human right. It feels ancient. It feels like the absolute default state of human existence. But historically speaking, it is nothing more than a temporary blip. Absolute privacy is a brand new, highly unnatural invention of the late 20th century. For the vast majority of modern history, privacy was a luxury you literally could not buy, no matter how much money you had in the bank. And recognizing that fragile, highly recent history sets up a fascinating, almost tragic paradox when we look at the hyper-connected world we live in right now. Because we spent nearly a century fighting tooth and nail to get our nosy neighbors off our copper wires, completely unaware of the massive, invisible surveillance machine that was waiting for us just over the horizon. That old, incredibly frustrating party line system, for all of its terrible flaws and inherent risks, accidentally functioned as a copper wire town square. It was a physical manifestation of community. It forced people to constantly negotiate space with their neighbors. It forced them to practice patience. It made absolutely everyone hyper-aware that their voice, their personal business, and their daily life were sharing a physical communal space with the people living around them. You couldn't ignore your neighbors because you were literally electrically tethered to them. Today, the paradigm has completely flipped. You hold a device that is seemingly impenetrable. You have biometric facial recognition, complex alphanumerical passcodes, and military-grade end-to-end encryption. You can sit alone in a dark room and send a message across the globe without making a single sound. But the bitter irony of our modern technological triumph is that we have actually never been monitored more closely. The party line, for all its faults, was honest. When someone was listening in on your conversation, you could hear them breathing. You could hear the faint click of the receiver being lifted in the background. The surveillance was physical, tangible, and human. Today, the surveillance is completely frictionless and entirely invisible. You no longer have to worry about the neighborhood gossip carefully lifting her receiver to eavesdrop on your romantic troubles or your financial struggles. We engineered her completely out of the system. Instead, every single keystroke you make, every search query you type, every location you visit, and every microsecond you pause to look at a photograph on a glowing screen is quietly tracked, perfectly recorded, and instantly auctioned off to advertisers by massive servers sitting in Silicon Valley. We successfully traded the annoying human eavesdropping of our neighbors for the silent, total surveillance of algorithmic machines. We escaped the local gossip, only to surrender our deepest secrets to a multi-billion-dollar data brokerage industry that never sleeps and never looks away. So, when you look at the device in your hand today, it is worth asking a very uncomfortable question. Is the digital isolation inside these encrypted, invisible walls really the privacy we spent nearly a century fighting for? Or did we just willingly sell our most intimate secrets to a much more efficient, highly profitable class of eavesdroppers? If this journey into the forgotten copper wires of our past made you look at your smartphone a little differently, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. We are constantly exploring the hidden histories, the forgotten systems, and the invisible forces that have quietly shaped the modern world we take for granted. Leave a comment below and let me know. Would you have survived the party line era? Or would you have been the neighborhood spy? Thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next untold story.